This is the second lecture on anti-predator adaptations. Last time we talked about how to prevent predators from finding you, and now we're going to build on that. Let's say that that fails. How can you dissuade the predator from attacking? Well, one of the things that some species do, social species particularly, is they mob a potential predator. So here's a drawing of some black-backed gulls mobbing what they perceive as a potential predator at their nesting colony. One of the things that mobbing gulls are attempting to do is drive the potential predator away from the area, or to actually kill the predator in some cases. But do all nests benefit from mobbing behavior? Here's some data from a study in which they experimentally placed chicken eggs along a transect in a gull colony. And what you see here is that eggs near the colony edge showed higher predation rates, and that mobbing intensity was greater in the colony interior as compared to the outskirts of the colony. So this chart is kind of demonstrating that in a fairly complex way, so let's just go through it in a little more detail. On the x-axis we have kind of the location of chicken eggs placed on the outskirts of the colony, right at the border, and then inside the colony, getting to the very center at E. The x-axis on the left is looking at the probabilities that crows, in this case with the potential predator, were subject to greater than 10 attacks by gulls per minute. So it's a measure of the intensity of mobbing. And you can see that outside of the colony there was very little mobbing, but as you got to the center of the colony it increased. Then if you just look at how effective this was, the percentage of successful predation attempts were relatively high on the outside of the colony and decreased as you got to the inside of the colony. So that appears to be pretty good evidence that mobbing is responsible for this. Are there any other potential explanations for this, particularly with regard to the predation attempts? Possibly. Probably not so much with a crow, but if this was a terrestrial predator, you might find similar results, but maybe the predator basically just gets full by eating all of the eggs on the outside of the colony, and the inside of the colony is relatively safe just because the predator hasn't tried to exploit that as a resource yet. So that's just one potential way that you'd have to think about interpreting these data. Well, mobbing behavior has actually evolved independently in numerous lineages, demonstrating this pattern of convergent evolution. That can be demonstrated in the figure here, showing that solitary swallows, swallows that nest in isolated territories, do not mob. Colonial swallows are the ones that tend to do this mobbing behavior. They're already in dense aggregations, and so it makes the formation of these mobs much easier. And it's the best interpretation is that mobbing evolved in the common ancestor of these species, that all of which are colonial swallows. If you look at gulls, for example, a lot of the gulls are nesting in colonies on the ground, and they probably ancestrally show mobbing behavior. But close relatives, kittiwakes and other gulls, nest on cliffs instead in more isolated areas and do not show mobbing behavior. So in both of these cases, we're seeing two clades in which you see transitions from no mobbing to mobbing, or from mobbing to no mobbing, that make ecological sense. And so this demonstrates convergent evolution to behaviors that match the ecological pressures. Here's just another example of a lineage that mobs. California ground squirrels and other squirrels as well will mob rattlesnakes to try to confuse the predator. They'll do like fake attacks. They'll actually try to shove dirt and sand into the snake, eventually driving the snake away from the area. One of the species that I've studied, blue-tailed bee eaters, nest in dense colonies, and we've observed colonial mobbing as being a very effective way of driving off predators. In fact, we've seen birds to kill snake predators on 3 different occasions. Here's one of these that I personally witnessed a snake approaching the colony, eliciting this mobbing behavior. These birds are bright blue and green, and so you can see some of them here congregating in this grassy area to which they've driven this snake. And here's a video produced by the National Park in Taiwan where we were doing our study, where they witnessed mobbing behavior of a snake. So let me play this for you.
这条蛇悄悄展开偷袭，但是幼鸟惊惶的叫声马上引起了成鸟的注意。它们一边急促地互相呼唤，一边迅速地集结起来。 凌厉的利口风虎在半空中集体对蛇展开猛烈的攻势。这条蛇寡不敌众，只好丢下盗贼的猎物，赶紧逃命。但是利口风虎能不罢休。
So basically what you can see is the snake is definitely being mobbed by the birds. It did successfully get one fledgling, but obviously the birds are preventing it from being successful in any other way. And notice how the snake is constantly trying to get on those little patches of leaf litter. The sand here is incredibly hot. So that's one of the potential threats that the snake faces. The other threat is from the impact of the birds themselves. The snake that I personally saw bee eaters kill, all of the jabs from the bill that had damaged the snake, majority of them were concentrated on the head. In fact, most of them were concentrated right around the eyes. And so that's how they killed that snake. So this snake is basically trying to get away, but it's also trying to stay away from the really hot sand, and it just is very limited in where it can go because of the bird attacks. There it is, trying to find some shade and get off that hot sand using the leaf litter. Before I turn down the sound, you may have heard the name of this bird in Chinese. It is Li Ho Feng Fu, which stands for cinnamon-colored bee dragon. And there you can see the fate of the snake. It ended up dying, probably because of the heat exposure itself. All right, well, we actually collected some data on how often these birds will mob. We were doing some other data collection on provisioning rate, how often the birds were bringing food to their nest, but we noticed that they were mobbing a lot, and so we wanted to collect data exactly when mobbing occurs and what was the object being mobbed. So one of the things that we noticed was that there is definitely a positive effect of synchronized breeding in this species. As long as everybody was at the colony, everybody was nesting at the same time, there were a lot of individuals around that could potentially mob a potential predator. Toward the end of the study, here around the 25th of July, all of the pairs had fledge their young except for one pair. And on this day, we actually watched two snakes basically just kind of going at will in and out of holes in the colony. And the two birds were trying to mob these snakes and drive them from the area, but they just weren't nearly as effective at this. And the snakes were basically just ignoring them. But as you can tell from the distribution here, ignore the fact that midday there's nothing, but that's just because we were not collecting data that. We were collecting data in the early morning and in the afternoon. But you can see that throughout the time period, snakes were a big-time predator. These are the diamond symbols. The unknown symbols in blue, we couldn't see exactly what the potential prey species or predator species was, but we think probably in a lot of cases it was just snakes in the grass that we couldn't see. Notice around early July, we started seeing a kingfisher come to the area. This kingfisher is known in cases to eat other birds, and what it was doing is it was showing up at the entrance of the cavities during the time period when the young birds were getting mobile enough that the parents weren't going into the cavity to feed them, but they were actually coming to the entrance to get fed. And so we think this kingfisher or kingfishers were approaching these cavities to try to trick the young to come to the entrance, think they're going to get food, but actually be attacked instead. We never actually saw the kingfisher successfully do this, but this is the time of development of the nestlings that we saw this behavior. Well, with that data, we wanted to see how potentially colony size could affect the efficiency of mobbing. So I had a graduate student come back in a subsequent year and conduct some mobbing experiments on blue-tailed bee eaters. And what she did is she basically pulled, using some monofilament line, a model of a snake that was hidden, and then at one time period she'd start the experiment, it would crawl out from underneath this hidden area. She would pull it and it would look like it would be approaching the colony. And she did this at a number of colonies at a number of different sizes, including some isolated bee eater nests, some solitary nesting bee eaters. And this is the first result I wanted to show you. If you look at how the number of nests in a colony affects the percentage of trials that actually showed mobbing, you almost always had mobbing in cases where there were fairly large colonies, a large number of nests. Once you got to very isolated small colonies or completely isolated nests that were not colonial, the frequency of mobbing decreased significantly. In some cases, just no one ever responded. The snake made it all the way to the nest cavities without being detected. So obviously there is a potential benefit to being in large colonies just from the perspective of being able to sense that a potential predator is there and to elicit an alarm. But in those cases where a mobbing response did occur, how did number of nests or colony size affect how quickly a snake was detected? And this is being measured here by how close the snake got from the colony. And you can see that the snake was detected much farther away, and it never even made it to the colony before it was detected. But again, in small colonies and in isolated situations, oftentimes it wasn't discovered until it was right up next to the nest. Kind of another way of measuring that is how does colony size affect the average time to mobbing to basically cause a response when a response is given. And you can see it was just a matter of seconds in large colonies before someone saw this, and so the snake likely wouldn't have a chance of getting very close. But again, in the cases of small colonies and solitary nesting individuals, oftentimes it took considerably longer before the snake was seen. And so it would have potential to get closer and more of a threat. Okay, here's another example of mobbing behavior in animals. In the case of insects like this, usually we call it swarming, but it's effectively the same behavior. So obviously for any animal that was familiar with bees or wasps, this would be a pretty effective deterrent. Okay, what about other ways of dissuading attackers in addition to mobbing or swarming? Let's move on to talking about apostomatic coloration. Sometimes if you're poisonous or distasteful, it's a good idea to advertise that fact, and that's what apostomatic coloration does. It's usually bright yellows, oranges, reds with contrasting blacks to, instead of trying to hide, like we talked about in the first lecture of this series, you're trying to advertise that you're there, but you're trying to advertise the fact that if something eats you, you're going to make them sick, or you're toxic and you can actually kill them in some circumstances. Oftentimes species that use apostomatic colorations will aggregate, so being in a group is a more efficient way to train predators so the predators will learn to avoid this. So certain individuals will end up dying out in this circumstance. But as long as you're in a dense aggregation, the chance that you are the one that dies versus one of the individuals that benefits this is reduced. So some examples, obviously, monarch butterflies, ladybird beetles, bees, wasps, and here are some other examples of some moths and some other insects. So it's fairly common. Here's a classic study that demonstrated the unpalatable nature of monarch butterflies using captive blue jays. So a naive blue jay is presented with a butterfly which it readily rips apart and eats, and very quickly it starts to feel like something's just not right here and ends up spewing. Some organisms will dissuade attackers by mimicking another animal that is distasteful or in some ways dangerous. In this case, we call this Batesian mimicry. So you're actually an edible prey item, but you mimic something that is toxic or dangerous. So in the picture here, there are two insects that look very similar. The one on the left is actually a fly, and you can tell that because it only has a single pair of wings. It has two wings, as opposed to the bee on the right that has two pair of wings. Viceroy butterflies mimic monarch butterflies, and actually it turns out that some monarchs are actually palatable, and they can take advantage of the fact that other monarchs are toxic because of their diet. Here's an example of a taphridid fruit fly that is mimicking a jumping spider. It basically has these patterns in its wings, and it waves its wings when it's threatened. That makes it look like a jumping spider is approaching and about to attack. Here's actually some data that was used in an experiment to demonstrate this capability. Basically what they did is they took fruit flies from A, B, and C here, and also house flies as D and E. But they had these 5 different groups where they had flies that they presented them to potential jumping spider predators and looked at the response of the jumping spider. Okay, so let me explain what the manipulations are. Well, one group that they presented to the jumping spiders was just an unmanipulated fruit fly, A, and an unmanipulated housefly, E. But then they took other groups of flies, chopped off their wings. So if they chopped off the wing of a fruit fly, they then glued on the wing of a housefly, because the housefly wings are clear. So that's what's shown in C. And in D, they took the wings that they chopped off of the individuals in the C class and gave them to the individuals in the D class. So now what this is doing is now the C individuals, they still wave their wings because they're fruit flies and they have that behavior, but now they're waving clear wings. So the question is waving a clear wing going to be good enough to scare away a potential jumping spider? In D, they're basically testing the opposite of that, or the other aspect of this complex trait. They're saying, okay, well, if you just have the banding pattern in your wings, is that good enough to scare away a jumping spider? But if you don't move it, because house flies don't move their wings, don't twitch them like the fruit flies do. Okay, if you just had those four comparison groups, the two unmanipulated and these where you've reciprocally swapped the wings, that wouldn't be good enough. You don't have an experimental control. You have to make sure that the manipulation you're doing here is not causing some untoward behavior in the flies. So basically what you do for the control group is you take the fruit flies, you chop off their wings, and then just glue them right back on. And if the manipulation itself isn't causing some unusual behaviors, then the data in the B category should be very similar to the data in the A category. And that is actually what we see here. So if we just look at the jumping spider's response, did it have an initial retreat? And in the case of 15 out of the 20 cases, it did retreat initially in the A and B treatment. Only 1 out of 20 in the C and D, and never in the case of E. So we have two basic groups here. We've got the situation where if you've got both of the traits, you're pretty good. If you just have one of them, it's really not helping you much. Same thing for stalk and attack. Do the spiders stalk and attack the flies? Well, they very rarely did that for B and never for A. For C, D, and E, that was fairly common. And then if you look at the eventual survival, what about the kill rate? You see that in the cases of C, D, and E, there was a significantly higher kill rate than in A and B. So this definitely does appear to be an adaptive strategy to mimic something that looks scary, like a jumping spider, because a jumping spider is a jumping spider's worst enemy. They're very dangerous to each other. And so if you can scare a jumping spider, you have a greater shot of preventing that attack and being killed. But the study also demonstrates that it really takes both aspects of the trait, the wing movement and the banding pattern of the wings, for it to be effective. Here's some other examples of mimicry, of Batesian mimicry, in which a harmless organism is trying to say that it's big, bad, and scary. So here we have a caterpillar that looks very similar to a vine snake. And on the right, gopher snakes and also burrowing owls will mimic the sounds of rattlesnakes when they're approached by a predator. And again, this may just deter the predator, make it think twice about attacking either the gopher snake or the burrowing owl. Now there's another type of mimicry called Munerian mimicry. And in Munerian mimicry, a toxic prey mimics another toxic prey, just so that it can take advantage of maybe that other species already having trained the community, but backing it up with some toxicity of their own to further enhance that training period. And one of my favorite examples of this is regard to these poison dart frogs from South America, actually in 3 different regions of Peru. The row on the bottom is 3 different species of poison dart frogs. The one on the top are poison frogs of a single species, but in different geographic regions where they overlap with a different member of another species, they only match the species in which they're sympatric. So the top one here in A is mimicking the species D. The B variant of this one species is mimicking species E, and C variant is mimicking, not quite as successfully, but F, probably enough to make a predator remember that basic pattern. Kind of helps to reinforce that this could be a bad organism. Sometimes you might be able to dissuade an attacker by your association with some other protective species. This is the situation with the coevolution of lycaenid butterflies and ant protectors. The butterflies have less parasite and fewer predators when they are cohabiting with ants on the same plants. And there was an experimental study in Australia to demonstrate this at 2 different locations where they either left the ants there, and the black bars here, and looked at the mortality of larvae at different instar or developmental stages. And then in another group, what they did is they took the ants away from the plants and then put tanglefoot on the bottom of that to prevent the ants from crawling back up, so that it basically left the larva without this potential protecting species. And sure enough, their mortality rate definitely went up. The same basic pattern happened in Canberra, but the results were even more extreme there. Apparently the ant protectors are more important in the Canberra population. And this is an example of coevolution because obviously the butterflies are getting an advantage from this living association, but this is a mutualism because the ants are also, there's a reason why they're being so aggressive in defending these. The butterflies actually produce a secretion that the ants feed off of, so it's basically like the livestock for the ants. Rufous-naped wrens in Central and South America nest near a wasp nest, and this association with this dangerous animal has been shown to lead to less depredation by monkeys, from 10% where they nest with the wasps to about 50% of nests being attacked by monkeys when they fail to nest near wasps. So it's definitely an adaptive choice when the wasps can be found. The final kind of tactic we're going to talk about of ways to dissuade attackers is to advertise your health or your unprofitability. We've already talked a little bit about stotting behavior when we were talking about communication, being an honest signaling situation. Thompson's gazelle is a species that stot, and again, this stotting is where you jump way up in the air, and what this does is it tells predators, one, hey, I've spotted you. So if you think you can sneak up on me, you might as well just go try it somewhere else. But the other thing is it demonstrates the health of the individual. It's an honest signal of their ability to jump high, which probably translates in their ability to run away quickly and escape if the predator does attack. And sure enough, when gazelles stot, it tends to deter the predator from attacking. So you can see that the hunt is abandoned in many cases, and when it does proceed, usually it's never successful. The chase failed in this one study, and so it was a signal that the predator should have paid attention to. When gazelles don't stot, then the hunt is less likely to be abandoned. About the same number fail, but you see now a high fraction of the gazelles in this situation are killed. Many of you have probably witnessed anolis lizards doing these push-ups. Other lizards do this as well when they see a potential competitor as far as another male, or want to show off to a female, but also when they see a potential predator, they'll do these push-up displays. And again, in all those circumstances, it's an honest signal of the health of the individual. In the case of trying to deter a predator, it's an honest signal of running ability. And so in a study of this one species of anolis lizards, what they did is they took the lizards on some days, and they basically made them run these bursts down the hall, and basically saw how long they could keep going. And then on other days, once they gave them a chance to rest, they measured how many push-ups each individual lizard could do. And as you can see here, the sprint endurance is strongly correlated with the number of push-ups. So when this lizard is doing push-ups in a natural setting, if it can do a lot really fast, it's basically telling the predator, hey, look, you're not going to be able to find me because I can run really fast. So in review, there are numerous ways prey species can dissuade a predator from attacking. We talked about mobbing, where the mobbers are all gathering together to kill or drive a predator from an area. This is oftentimes easier to do in group living or colonial organisms, and so we see lots of convergent evolution in lineages to practice mobbing that are also group living or colonial. Other species demonstrate to predators, communicate to predators the fact that they're toxic or potentially dangerous with apostomatic coloration. So instead of hiding, they're actually advertising that they're there, but they're advertising unprofitability in that way. Some species will mimic apostomatic or dangerous prey to try to make a predator think twice. And then we also talked about how species will advertise their health or unprofitability in that way as prey items to try to get the predator to move on and try someone else.